The stagecoach lurched violently as the front wheels struck something in the rutted mountain road. Clara Whitmore grabbed the leather strap above her head, her knuckles turning white as the entire world seemed to tilt sideways. The driver's curse reached her ears just before the sickening crack of splintering wood filled the air. Time slowed. Clara saw the door swing open, saw the rocky ground rushing up to meet her, and then everything became a chaos of tumbling bodies, screaming horses, and the terrible sound of metal and wood colliding with earth. When the world finally stopped spinning, Clara found herself lying on her back, staring up at an impossibly blue Colorado sky. The October sun filtered through the golden aspen leaves above her, and for one peaceful moment she thought perhaps she was dreaming. Then the pain arrived. It came in waves, starting from somewhere below her waist and radiating outward until her entire body felt like it had been set aflame. She tried to move, tried to sit up, but her legs refused to respond. They lay there, twisted at an angle that made her stomach lurch, utterly useless. "Help!" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the groaning of the other passengers and the panicked whinnies of the horses. "Someone! Please!" The driver was unconscious, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had been traveling to see her grandchildren in Denver, was being helped from the wreckage by Mr. Howell, a traveling salesman who seemed more concerned about his case of samples than anything else. No one was coming for her. Clara closed her eyes and tried to breathe through the pain. She had survived so much already. The death of her father when she was just 16. The years of working as a seamstress in Boston, her fingers raw and bleeding from endless hours of stitching. The betrayal of her fiancé, Edward, who had left her for a woman with a larger dowry and better social connections. The scandal that had followed, whispered rumors that had made it impossible for her to find respectable work in any shop that valued its reputation. She had come west to escape all of that. To start fresh as a schoolteacher in the small town of Silver Creek, where no one knew her name or her shame. She had spent her last $20 on this stagecoach ticket, had packed everything she owned into one small trunk, and had allowed herself to hope. And now, here she lay, broken on a mountain road, in the middle of nowhere, with not a single person coming to help her. The tears came then, hot and silent, streaming down her temples and into her hair. She had been foolish to think she could outrun her fate. Some people were simply not meant for happiness, and Clara Whitmore was clearly one of them. She must have lost consciousness, because when she opened her eyes again, the sun had moved significantly in the sky, and the shadows of the aspens had grown longer. The sounds of the other passengers had faded, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees. They had left her. The realization struck her like a physical blow. They had taken the horses, salvaged what they could from the wreckage, and left her lying in the dirt like a piece of discarded luggage. She supposed she couldn't blame them. What good was a woman who couldn't walk? She would only slow them down, and the nearest town was still miles away. Still, the abandonment stung. Clara tried again to move her legs, but they remained stubbornly unresponsive. The pain had settled into a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to pulse with every beat of her heart. She could feel the cold seeping up from the ground beneath her, could see the shadows growing longer as the afternoon slowly surrendered to evening. If she stayed here, she would die, either from her injuries or from the cold or from the wolves she could hear howling in the distance. It was simply a matter of which would claim her first. She closed her eyes and began to pray. The sound of hoofbeats made her eyes fly open again. For a wild moment, she thought perhaps God had sent an angel to rescue her. But the figure that emerged from the tree line was decidedly not angelic. He was enormous. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to block out the setting sun. He rode a horse the color of midnight, and his face was hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. A rifle rested in a scabbard at his side, and his clothes were the practical worn garments of a man who worked the land. He brought his horse to a stop a few feet away and sat there for a long moment, looking down at her. Clara could feel his gaze moving over her body, assessing the damage, and she felt suddenly intensely aware of how vulnerable she was. She was a woman alone, injured, unable to run or fight. If this man meant her harm, there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop him. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, "please don't hurt me." The man swung down from his horse with a grace that seemed impossible for someone his size. He moved toward her slowly, carefully, the way one might approach a wounded animal. When he finally crouched down beside her, she caught her first glimpse of his face, and her breath caught in her throat. He was not handsome, not in the classical sense. His features were too rough, too weathered, his jaw too square and his nose slightly crooked, as if it had been broken at some point and never properly set. But his eyes were the deep, rich brown of fertile earth, and they held a gentleness that seemed completely at odds with the rest of him. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, and his voice was low and rough, like gravel wrapped in velvet. "Can you tell me your name?" "Clara," she managed. "Clara Whitmore." He nodded once, as if filing that information away for later use. "I'm Silas Hartley. I have a farm about 30 kilometers from here. Can you move at all?" Clara shook her head, fresh tears springing to her eyes. "My legs. I can't feel them. I tried, but they won't." She couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of her situation was too overwhelming, too terrifying to put into words. Silas's jaw tightened, but his eyes remained gentle. He reached out and carefully touched her hip, her knee, her ankle, his calloused fingers surprisingly light against her skirts. Clara flinched, more from surprise than pain. "I need to check if anything's broken," he explained, his voice steady. "May I?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. His hands moved with clinical precision, feeling along her legs, pressing gently against the bones. When he reached her right ankle, Clara gasped as a sharp bolt of pain shot through her. "Broken," Silas said quietly, "and I suspect there's some damage to your lower spine. The fact that you can't feel your legs." He paused, his brow furrowing. "It might be temporary, swelling, pressing on the nerves. Or it might be—" He didn't finish that sentence either. Clara understood what he wasn't saying. The injury might be permanent. She might never walk again. "Can you leave me here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Just go get help? A doctor?" Silas shook his head slowly. "Nearest doctor is in Silver Creek, and that's a good 2 days' ride. By the time I got back with help, you'd be dead. The temperature drops below freezing at night this time of year, and there are wolves in these mountains. They've already caught your scent, I imagine." He stood up and walked back to his horse, and for one terrible moment, Clara thought he was going to leave her there after all. But he returned a moment later with a canteen and a blanket, which he tucked carefully around her body. "Drink this," he said, pressing the canteen to her lips. The water was cool and clean, and Clara drank greedily, suddenly aware of how parched she was. "What are we going to do?" she asked when she had finished. Silas looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he knelt down beside her and slipped one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back. "I'm going to carry you," he said simply, 30 kilometers to my farm. My horse can't bear both our weights over this terrain, and the wagon road is washed out from the autumn rains, so I'm going to carry you." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious. 30 kilometers, that's impossible." "I've done harder things," Silas said, and something in his voice made Clara believe him. "Now, this is going to hurt. I'm sorry, but there's no way around it." I need you to put your arms around my neck and hold on as tight as you can. Can you do that for me?" Clara nodded, though her heart was pounding with fear. She wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling the solid warmth of him through the worn fabric of his shirt. He smelled like leather and pine and something else, something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken despite her pain. "Ready?" he asked. She wasn't, not even close. But she nodded anyway, and Silas lifted her into his arms. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot lance that shot through her entire body and stole the breath from her lungs. Clara cried out, her fingers digging into Silas's shoulders, her vision going grey at the edges. "I know," Silas murmured, his voice low and soothing. "I know it hurts. Just breathe, deep breaths. That's it. The worst is over now." He was lying, of course. The worst was definitely not over. Every step he took sent fresh waves of agony through Clara's body, and she had to bite her lip to keep from screaming. But there was something comforting about the steady rhythm of his stride, the solid warmth of his arms around her, the gentle rumble of his voice as he continued to murmur reassurances. They travelled in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath Silas's boots and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. Clara kept her face pressed against his shoulder, partly because the pain was easier to bear when she couldn't see the world jolting past, and partly because she didn't trust herself to look at him. He was a stranger, a complete stranger, who had appeared out of nowhere and decided to carry her 30 kilometers through the wilderness. It was the sort of thing that happened in fairy tales, not in real life. Real life was full of men like Edward, who made promises they never intended to keep and abandoned women the moment they became inconvenient. "You should have left me," Clara said finally, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I'm just a stranger. You don't owe me anything." Silas's stride didn't falter. "My mother used to say that we're all strangers until we're not. She believed that every person who crosses our path is there for a reason. And what reason could there possibly be for me to be lying broken on a mountain road?" "I don't know," Silas admitted, "but I stopped asking God to explain himself a long time ago. Now I just try to do what's right and trust that the rest will work itself out." There was something in his voice, a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion, and Clara found herself wanting to know more. But it seemed wrong to pry into the life of a man who was literally carrying her to safety, so she kept her questions to herself and focused on surviving the journey. The sun had fully set by the time they stopped to rest. Silas carefully lowered Clara onto a fallen log, then built a small fire to ward off the growing chill. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face as he worked, and Clara found herself studying him with a curiosity she couldn't quite explain. He moved with the economy of motion that came from years of hard work, every gesture purposeful and precise. His hands, large and calloused, handled the kindling with surprising delicacy, coaxing the flames to life with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world. "You were in the army," Clara said suddenly. It wasn't a question. She had seen enough soldiers in Boston, had watched them march through the streets during the war, to recognize the way Silas held himself. He paused for a moment, then nodded. "Cavalry. Served under Sherman during the last years of the war, then spent another 5 years out here fighting Indians. And now you're a farmer?" "Now I'm a farmer," he confirmed, his voice carefully neutral. "Got myself a piece of land in the valley about 5 years ago, built a cabin, dug a well, started raising cattle and growing wheat. It's a quiet life, but I prefer it that way." Clara heard what he wasn't saying as clearly as what he was. The war had changed him, had left scars that went deeper than anything visible on his skin. She understood that kind of damage, had her own invisible wounds that she carried with her everywhere she went. "I was engaged once," she heard herself say, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. His name was Edward. He was the son of a textile merchant, handsome and charming and everything a girl dreams about. We were supposed to be married last spring, but then his father found a better match for him, a banker's daughter with a $20,000 dowry, and just like that, I was yesterday's news. She wasn't sure why she was telling him this. Maybe it was the darkness, which made it easier to confess things she would never admit in the light of day. Maybe it was the pain, which had worn down her defenses until she had none left. Or maybe it was simply the fact that this man had chosen to carry her 30 kilometers through the wilderness, and that kind of kindness deserved honesty in return. "Edward is a fool," Silas said quietly. Clara laughed, a bitter sound that seemed to hang in the cold air. "That's what my friend Mary said. She told me I was better off without him. That any man who would throw a woman aside for money wasn't worth having. But it didn't feel that way. It felt like I had been weighed and measured and found wanting, and no amount of telling myself otherwise could change that." Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he moved to sit beside her on the log, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, but not so close that they were touching. "I know something about being weighed and measured," he said, his voice low. "When I came back from the war, I wasn't the same man who had left. I had seen things, done things, that changed me in ways I couldn't explain. My family, my friends, the girl I had been courting, they all looked at me like I was a stranger, like the person they had known was dead, and something else had come back in his place." Clara turned to look at him, her heart aching at the pain she saw in his eyes. "What happened to the girl?" "She married someone else," Silas said simply. "A shopkeeper from town. He was safe, predictable, normal. Everything I wasn't anymore. I don't blame her for the choice she made. She deserved a man who could give her a peaceful life, and I wasn't capable of that. Not then. Maybe not ever." They sat in silence for a while, watching the flames dance and listening to the sounds of the night. In the distance, a wolf howled, and another answered, but the sounds seemed far away, less threatening now that Clara had the warmth of the fire and the solid presence of Silas beside her. "We should keep moving," Silas said finally. "We've still got a long way to go, and I want to reach the farm before sunrise if we can." Clara nodded, and Silas lifted her into his arms again. The pain was still there, but it had faded to a dull roar, manageable if not comfortable. She wrapped her arms around his neck and let her head rest against his shoulder, too exhausted to maintain even the pretense of propriety. They traveled through the night, Silas's boots crunching steadily over the forest floor. The moon rose, full and silver, casting the landscape in an ethereal light that made everything look dreamlike and unreal. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of little beyond the rhythm of Silas's heartbeat and the gentle sway of his stride. At some point, she realized she was no longer afraid. Not of the wolves, not of the cold, not even of her injury and what it might mean for her future. Silas would get her to safety. She knew that with a certainty she couldn't explain, a bone-deep trust in this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and decided to save her life. "Tell me about your farm," she murmured, her voice drowsy. "What's it like?" Silas's chest rumbled with something that might have been a laugh. "It's nothing fancy. Just a cabin, a barn, and a few 100 acres of land. But there's a creek that runs through the property, and in the spring the whole valley fills with wildflowers. Lupines and columbines and Indian paintbrush, more colors than you can imagine. It's the most beautiful place I've ever seen." "It sounds lovely," Clara said, and she meant it. She had grown up in the crowded streets of Boston, surrounded by brick and cobblestone and the constant noise of city life. The idea of a quiet cabin in a valley full of wildflowers was like something from a dream. "It gets lonely sometimes," Silas admitted. "I don't mind my own company, but there are nights when the silence feels like too much. When I would give anything just to hear another voice." Clara thought about her own loneliness, the years she had spent in her tiny Boston apartment, stitching by candlelight until her eyes burned and her fingers bled. She'd been surrounded by people, millions of them, and yet she had never felt more alone. At least Silas had chosen his isolation. Hers had been thrust upon her. "I was going to be a school teacher," she said, "in Silver Creek. There was a position open and they didn't ask for references, just proof that I could read and write and do basic arithmetic. It was supposed to be my fresh start, a new life in a new place where no one knew my name." "Silver Creek is about 40 kilometers east of my farm," Silas said. "It's a decent town, growing fast now that the railroad is coming through. They could use a good teacher." "If I can walk again?" Clara said, and this time she didn't try to hide the bitterness in her voice. "What use is a school teacher who can't even stand at a blackboard?" Silas stopped walking. Clara looked up, confused, and found him staring down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and fierce. "You don't know what's going to happen, none of us do, but I've seen men take bullets and walk again. I've seen men lose limbs and go on to live full lives. The human body is capable of incredible things when given the chance to heal, so don't you dare give up before you've even tried." Clara stared at him, stunned into silence by the passion in his words. No one had ever spoken to her like that before, had ever looked at her as if she was capable of anything more than what circumstance had made of her. "Why do you care?" she whispered. "You don't even know me." Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he started walking again, his stride steady and sure. "Because I know what it's like to be broken," he said finally, "and I know that sometimes all a person needs is someone to believe in them when they've stopped believing in themselves." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all. She simply closed her eyes and let Silas carry her through the night, trusting him with her body, and in some strange way she couldn't quite articulate, with her heart as well. Dawn was breaking over the mountains when they finally reached the farm. Clara opened her eyes to see a modest cabin nestled in a valley, exactly as Silas had described. A creek ran along the edge of the property, glittering gold in the early morning light, and the remnants of a summer garden surrounded the front porch. Beyond the cabin stood a weathered barn, and in the distance she could see cattle grazing on the hillside. It was, without question, the most beautiful place Clara had ever seen. Silas carried her up the steps to the cabin, kicking open the door with his boot. The interior was simple but clean, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a wooden table and chairs positioned near a small kitchen area. A bed stood in the corner, covered with a faded quilt, and shelves lined the walls, filled with books and supplies. He laid her gently on the bed, then stepped back, his face drawn with exhaustion. He had carried her 30 kilometers through the wilderness without rest, and only now did Clara realize what that had cost him. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his shoulders sagged with fatigue. "You need to sleep," she said. Silas shook his head. "I need to take care of that ankle first, and we should send word to the doctor in Silver Creek. Have him come out as soon as he can." He moved around the cabin with efficient purpose, starting a fire in the fireplace, boiling water, gathering supplies. Clara watched him from the bed, marveling at his quiet competence, at the way he seemed to know exactly what needed to be done and how to do it. When he returned to her side, he was carrying strips of clean cloth and a bowl of warm water. "I'm going to have to set that ankle," he said, his voice apologetic. "It's going to hurt, I won't lie to you about that, but it needs to be done now, before the swelling gets any worse." Clara nodded, her heart pounding. She had never been particularly good with pain, had always been the kind of child who cried at the slightest scrape or bruise. But something had changed inside her during the long journey through the night. She had survived things she never thought she could survive, and she was determined to keep surviving. "Do what you have to do," she said. Silas nodded. He carefully removed her boot, revealing an ankle that was swollen and discolored, a deep purple bruise spreading across the skin. Clara looked away, unable to bear the sight of her own damaged body. "On 3, Silas said. 1, 2. He didn't wait for 3. There was a sharp, grinding sensation, followed by a bolt of agony so intense that Clara screamed. Her vision went white, then grey, and for a moment she thought she might pass out. But then Silas's hand was on her cheek, his voice cutting through the haze of pain. "It's done. Clara, it's done. The worst is over. Just breathe. That's it. Deep breaths. You're doing so well." Clara blinked, and the world slowly came back into focus. Silas was leaning over her, his brown eyes filled with concern, his thumb gently stroking her cheekbone. It was such an intimate gesture, such a tender expression of care, that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was apologizing for. "Don't be," Silas said. "You did better than most soldiers I've seen. Now let me wrap this up, and then you need to rest." He worked quickly and efficiently, wrapping her ankle in the strips of cloth and elevating it on a pillow. Then he pulled the quilt up over her body and stepped back, his expression unreadable. "I'm going to ride into town and send word to the doctor," he said. "I'll be back before nightfall. Will you be all right here alone?" Clara nodded, though the truth was she didn't want him to go. She felt safe with Silas, safer than she had felt in years, and the thought of being alone, even for a few hours, made her anxious. "There's food in the kitchen if you get hungry," Silas continued. "Water in the barrel by the door, and if you need anything, just call for me. I'll hear you." He was almost to the door when Clara called out, "Silas." He turned, his hand on the latch. "Thank you," Clara said, "for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Silas's expression softened. "You don't owe me anything, Clara. Just get well. That's all the payment I need." And then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him, leaving Clara alone in the quiet cabin with nothing but her thoughts for company. She slept for most of the day, drifting in and out of dreams that blended with reality until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. She dreamed of Edward, of the look on his face when he told her he was marrying someone else. She dreamed of Boston, of the cramped apartment and the endless hours of stitching, of fingers that bled and eyes that burned. And she dreamed of Silas, of strong arms and gentle hands and brown eyes that held a tenderness she had never expected to find. When she finally woke, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. The fire had burned down to embers and the room was growing cold. Clara shivered, pulling the quilt tighter around her body. She tried to move her legs again, hoping against hope that the sensation had returned while she slept. But they remained stubbornly unresponsive, and Clara felt a fresh wave of despair wash over her. She was going to be crippled for the rest of her life. She would never walk again, never dance, never run through a field of wildflowers or climb a mountain or do any of the things she had dreamed of doing. She would be a burden, dependent on others for everything, unable to care for herself or earn her own way. The teaching position in Silver Creek would go to someone else, and she would have to, what? Go back to Boston, find some charitable institution that would take her in, spend the rest of her days being pitied and patronized by well-meaning strangers. The tears came then, hot and bitter, and Clara didn't try to stop them. She cried for the life she had lost, for the dreams that had been stolen from her, for the unfairness of a world that seemed determined to crush her spirit at every turn. She was still crying when the door opened and Silas walked in. He stopped short at the sight of her tears, his expression shifting from tired to concerned in the span of a heartbeat. "Clara, what's wrong? Are you in pain?" Clara shook her head, unable to speak through her sobs. Silas crossed the room in 3 long strides and sat down on the edge of the bed, his hand finding hers and holding it tight. "Tell me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever it is, tell me. I want to help." "You can't help," Clara choked out. "No one can. I'm broken, Silas. I'm broken, and I'm never going to be whole again. I'm going to spend the rest of my life being a burden to everyone around me, and I can't bear it. I can't bear the thought of living like that." Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumb, his touch as gentle as it had been the night before. "Do you know why I came out here?" he asked, his voice soft. "To this farm, in the middle of nowhere, where the nearest neighbor is 20 kilometers away." Clara shook her head. "Because I thought I was broken too," Silas said. "When I came back from the war, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the men I had killed. I heard their screams, felt their blood on my hands. I thought I was going mad, and I didn't want anyone to see it happen. So I came out here, to hide from the world, to wait for death in a place where no one would have to watch me fall apart." Clara stared at him, her tears forgotten. This strong, capable man, this man who had carried her 30 kilometers through the wilderness, had once been as lost and hopeless as she felt now. It seemed impossible, and yet she could see the truth of it in his eyes. "What changed?" she whispered. Silas's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "One morning, about a year after I arrived, I woke up to find a horse in my yard. She was wild, half-starved, covered in scars from some predator's attack. She should have been dead, but she wasn't. She was fighting to survive, despite everything that had been done to her, and something about that woke me up. I spent 3 months nursing her back to health, and somewhere along the way, I started healing too." He glanced toward the window, and Clara followed his gaze to where the black horse was standing in the yard, its mane rippling in the evening breeze. "That's the same horse?" she asked. Silas nodded. "Her name is Midnight. She's the best horse I've ever had, loyal and strong and brave. And every time I look at her, I'm reminded that broken things can be mended. That survival is its own kind of victory." Clara was quiet for a long moment, thinking about what he had said. The idea that she might heal, that she might find a way to live with her injury and even thrive despite it, seemed as distant and impossible as the stars. And yet, looking at Silas, looking at the way he had rebuilt his life from the ashes of his own despair, she felt a tiny spark of hope flickering to life in her chest. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," Silas said, "but you don't have to be scared alone. I'm here, Clara, and I'm not going anywhere." He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. But to Clara, who had spent her entire life being abandoned by the people she loved, it was nothing short of revolutionary. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do that for me? You barely know me." Silas's eyes met hers, and something in their depths made Clara's heart skip a beat. "Maybe because I see something in you," he said quietly. "Something worth fighting for, something worth believing in." Clara didn't know what to say to that. She had never thought of herself as someone worth fighting for, had always assumed that she was ordinary, forgettable, easily replaced. But the way Silas was looking at her made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. Silas stood up, and Clara felt the loss of his warmth like a physical ache. "That'll be the doctor," he said. "I sent word to Silver Creek. He agreed to come out tonight." The doctor was a small, bespectacled man named Henry Wells. He examined Clara thoroughly, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. When he was finished, he pulled Silas aside to confer in low voices, but Clara could see enough of their faces to know that the news was not good. "Well," she demanded when Dr. Wells finally turned to address her, "what's the verdict? Am I going to walk again?" The doctor hesitated, glancing at Silas before answering. "The truth is, Miss Whitmore, I don't know. Your ankle will heal with time and rest, but the damage to your spine is more concerning. There's significant swelling around the vertebrae, which is likely what's causing the paralysis. If the swelling goes down—" "If," Clara repeated. "It's too early to say," Dr. Wells admitted. "The body is capable of remarkable healing, but it's also unpredictable. I've seen patients with similar injuries make full recoveries, and I've seen others who never regained feeling. I wish I could give you a more definitive answer, but at this point, all we can do is wait and see." Clara felt her hope deflating like a punctured balloon. Wait and see, that was doctor speak for "we have no idea what's going to happen to you." She had heard it before, when her father was dying of consumption, when the doctors had stood by his bedside and made empty promises they knew they couldn't keep. "How long?" she asked. "How long do I have to wait?" "A few weeks at least," the doctor said. "Possibly longer. In the meantime, you should stay off your feet, keep your spine as immobile as possible, and try not to strain yourself. Mr. Hartley has agreed to let you stay here while you recover. It's closer than Silver Creek, and the journey might do more harm than good." Clara turned to look at Silas, surprised. He was standing by the fireplace, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression guarded. It was a generous offer, too generous. She was a stranger, an interloper, and she had no right to impose on his hospitality any more than she already had. "I can't," she said. "It's too much. You've already done more than enough for me." "It's not enough," Silas said quietly. "Not nearly enough." Something in his tone made Clara's breath catch. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could take care of herself, but the truth was she couldn't. She was helpless, dependent, and the only person offering to help her was this quiet, complicated man who had carried her 30 kilometers through the wilderness. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay, but only until I'm well enough to travel." Silas nodded, and something that might have been relief flickered across his face. "That's all I ask." The doctor left, after giving Clara detailed instructions for her care, along with a bottle of laudanum for the pain. Silas saw him out, then returned to the cabin and set about making supper. Clara watched him from the bed, marveling at the ease with which he moved around the small kitchen, chopping vegetables and stirring the pot that hung over the fire. "You're a good cook," she observed, when he brought her a bowl of stew and a thick slice of bread. Silas's lips quirked. "I've had plenty of practice. When you live alone, you learn to fend for yourself." They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl outside. It was peaceful, Clara realized. Despite everything, despite the pain and the uncertainty and the fear, there was something deeply peaceful about being here, in this simple cabin, with this quiet man. "Tell me about the war," she said suddenly. "Not the fighting, the rest of it. The parts no one talks about." Silas looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing whether to answer. Then he set down his bowl and leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "The thing about war that no one tells you," he said slowly, "is how much of it is just waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for supplies, waiting for the enemy to show up, or the weather to clear, or some general to decide what to do with you. I spent more time sitting around campfires than I ever did fighting." "What did you do?" "While you were waiting." "Talked mostly. The men I served with, they came from all over. Farmers from Ohio, shopkeepers from New York, school teachers from Massachusetts. We had nothing in common except the war. But that was enough. We told stories, shared memories, tried to hold on to the parts of ourselves that the fighting was trying to take away." Clara thought about that, about the men who had sat around campfires, talking about their homes and families, never knowing if they would live to see them again. It was heartbreaking and beautiful, a testament to the human need for connection, even in the darkest circumstances. "Did you lose friends?" she asked. Silas's jaw tightened. More than I could count. The worst was a man named Thomas from Pennsylvania. We enlisted together, served in the same unit for 2 years. He was the closest thing I had to a brother. And then, one day, a Confederate sniper put a bullet through his heart, and just like that, he was gone. No warning, no chance to say goodbye, just here one moment and gone the next. "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. Silas shrugged, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "It was a long time ago. Most days I don't think about it anymore, but then something will remind me, a sound or a smell or just a feeling, and it all comes rushing back like it happened yesterday." Clara understood that. The grief she felt for her father, the wound left by Edward's betrayal, they had never fully healed. They had just scabbed over, waiting for something to tear them open again. "I lost my father when I was 16, she said. "Consumption. It took him slowly, bit by bit, until there was nothing left. I used to sit by his bed and watch him sleep, terrified that every breath would be his last, and when it finally was, I felt relieved. Relieved that his suffering was over. Relieved that I didn't have to be afraid anymore. And then I felt guilty for feeling relieved, and that guilt has never really gone away." Silas reached across the space between them and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough, calloused from years of hard work, but his grip was gentle. "Grief is complicated," he said. "It doesn't follow the rules we want it to follow. All we can do is carry it with us and try not to let it crush us." Clara squeezed his hand, feeling a connection to this man that went beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. They were two wounded souls, each carrying their own burden of pain and loss. And in that moment, she felt less alone than she had in years. The days that followed settled into a comfortable routine. Clara spent most of her time in bed, reading the books that lined Silas's shelves and watching the autumn light shift across the cabin walls. Silas came and went, tending to the farm and the animals, but he always made time to sit with her, to talk and share meals, and simply be present. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Clara began to heal. Not just physically, though the swelling in her ankle was going down and the pain in her back was becoming more manageable. She was healing in other ways too, in the dark places inside her that had been wounded long before the stagecoach accident. Silas was a large part of that healing. He had a way of listening that made Clara feel heard, really heard, in a way she never had before. He didn't judge her for her fears or her failures, didn't offer empty platitudes or unwanted advice. He simply sat with her in her pain, bearing witness to her struggle, and somehow that was enough. One evening, about a week after her arrival, Clara felt a tingling sensation in her toes. It was faint at first, so faint that she thought she might be imagining it. But as she focused her attention on her feet, willing them to move, she felt it again, a tingling like pins and needles, spreading slowly up from her toes to her ankles. "Silas!" she called, her voice shaking with excitement. "Silas, come quickly!" He was at her side in an instant, his face tight with concern. "What is it? Are you in pain?" "No," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "No, the opposite. I can feel my toes. Silas, I can feel them." The joy that spread across his face was like watching the sun rise. He reached down and touched her foot, pressing gently against her toes. "Can you feel that?" he asked. Clara nodded, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, I can feel it. It's not much, but it's something. It's something." Silas pulled her into his arms then, holding her close against his chest. Clara could feel his heart pounding, could feel the trembling in his hands, and she realized that he had been just as scared as she was, that he had been carrying her fear along with his own, never letting on, never letting her see how much he had invested in her recovery. "I told you," he murmured against her hair. "I told you broken things can be mended." Clara pulled back just enough to look into his face. He was so close, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that she could feel his breath warm against her lips. Something shifted in the air between them, something electric and inevitable. "Silas," she whispered. He kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tender and careful, as if she was something precious that might shatter at too rough a touch. But there was passion in it too, a fire banked behind the gentleness, and Clara felt herself melting into him, her body responding in ways she had never experienced before. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Silas's eyes were dark, his pupils dilated, and Clara could feel the tension thrumming through his body like a plucked string. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "I shouldn't have. I don't want to take advantage." Clara silenced him with a finger against his lips. "You're not taking advantage of anything. I wanted that kiss just as much as you did. Maybe more." Silas's expression softened, and he reached up to cup her face in his hands. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I found you lying on that road, but I didn't imagine that I would feel the same way," Clara finished. He nodded, and she saw the vulnerability beneath his strength, the fear of rejection that he kept so carefully hidden. This man who had carried her 30 kilometers through the wilderness, who had nursed her back to health and believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself, was just as afraid of being hurt as she was. "I don't know what the future holds," Clara said honestly. "I don't know if I'll ever walk again, if I'll ever be able to take that teaching position or live the life I planned. But I know that being here with you has changed something in me. You've changed something in me, Silas. And whatever happens next, I want you to be part of it." Silas kissed her again, deeper this time, and Clara lost herself in the sensation of his lips against hers, his arms around her body, his heart beating in time with her own. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Clara's life. Her recovery continued, slowly but steadily. First, she regained feeling in her feet and ankles, then her calves and knees. By the third week, she could wiggle her toes on command, and by the fourth, she could move her legs, though they were still too weak to support her weight. Dr. Wells came to check on her regularly, and each visit brought more encouraging news. The swelling had gone down completely, and there appeared to be no permanent damage to her spine. With time and physical therapy, he believed she would make a full recovery. "You're a lucky woman, Miss Whitmore," he said during one of his visits. "Or perhaps lucky isn't the right word. You're a strong woman. Not everyone could have survived what you went through." Clara smiled, thinking of all the times she had thought of herself as weak, as fragile, as incapable of facing the challenges life threw at her. It was strange how much a person's perception of themselves could change when someone else believed in them. She and Silas grew closer with each passing day. They talked for hours, sharing stories and secrets and dreams, discovering all the ways they were alike and all the ways they were different. Silas told her about his childhood on a farm in Virginia, about his parents who had died during a cholera outbreak and the grandmother who had raised him in their absence. Clara told him about her mother, who had remarried after her father's death and moved to California with her new husband, leaving Clara behind to fend for herself. They discovered a shared love of books, devouring the volumes on Silas's shelves and discussing them long into the night. They discovered a shared sense of humor, laughing at each other's jokes and finding joy in the small absurdities of daily life. And they discovered a connection that went deeper than words, a bond forged in hardship and strengthened by kindness. Silas never pushed for more than Clara was ready to give. He was patient, respectful, always aware of her vulnerability and determined not to exploit it. But Clara could feel the desire in him, could see it in the way his eyes darkened when she touched him, could hear it in the catch of his breath when she leaned close. And she wanted him too, wanted him with an intensity that surprised her, that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. One night, As they sat together by the fire, Clara reached out and took Silas's hand. "I've been thinking," she said. Silas looked at her, his expression curious. "About what?" "About the teaching position in Silver Creek. Dr. Wells says I should be able to travel in another week or two, and I've been wondering, should I go, take the job, start my new life like I planned?" Something flickered in Silas's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or fear. But his voice was steady when he answered, "Is that what you want?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. When she had boarded that stagecoach in Boston, all she had wanted was to escape. To leave behind the wreckage of her old life and start fresh somewhere new, somewhere no one knew her name or her shame. She had been running from the past, not toward anything specific, just away. But now, sitting here in this cabin with this man, she wondered if running was really what she needed. If maybe what she needed was to stop, to stand still, to let herself be found. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me thinks I should go, the sensible part, the practical part. I need to earn a living, and teaching is the only skill I have, but another part of me doesn't want to leave." "What does that part want?" Silas asked, his voice low. Clara looked at him, at his strong jaw and gentle eyes, and the hands that had carried her 30 kilometers through the wilderness. She thought about all the times he had held her while she cried, all the times he had listened without judging, all the times he had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. "It wants to stay," she whispered. "With you." Silas's breath caught. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, tilting her chin up so that their eyes met. "If you stay," he said carefully, "I want you to know that I'm not asking for anything. You can have the spare room, you can come and go as you please, you can take the teaching job in Silver Creek and come back here at the end of each day. I won't pressure you for more than you're ready to give." "And if I want more?" Clara asked. "If I want everything?" Silas's eyes darkened. He leaned closer, close enough that his breath warmed her lips. "Then everything is yours," he said. "All of me. For as long as you want me." Clara kissed him. Not gently this time, not carefully. She kissed him with all the passion and desire she had been holding back, all the hunger and need that had been building inside her for weeks. She kissed him like a woman who knew exactly what she wanted, and was finally ready to claim it. Silas responded in kind, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close. His hands tangled in her hair, his mouth hot and insistent against hers. Clara felt herself being lifted, felt the solid strength of him as he carried her across the room, felt the soft give of the mattress as he laid her down on the bed. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with want. "I need you to be sure, Clara." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said, and then there were no more words, only the two of them, finding each other in the darkness, discovering the language of touch and breath and heartbeat. Silas was gentle, so gentle, his hands worshipping her body like it was something sacred, but there was fire beneath the gentleness, a passion that matched her own, and Clara gave herself over to it completely, holding nothing back. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath the quilt, listening to the wind howl outside and feeling the warmth of the fire on their skin. Clara's head rested on Silas's chest, and she could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, beneath her ear. "I love you," she said. The words came easily, naturally, as if they had been waiting all along to be spoken. Silas's arms tightened around her. "I love you too. I think I've loved you since the moment I found you lying on that road, looking up at the sky like you were waiting for a miracle." Clara smiled against his chest. "Maybe I was. Maybe you were the miracle I was waiting for." They were married in the spring, in the small church in Silver Creek, with Dr. Wells and his wife serving as witnesses. Clara walked down the aisle on her own 2 feet, still limping slightly, but growing stronger every day. Silas stood at the altar, looking more handsome than she had ever seen him, his brown eyes shining with love and joy, and something that looked like disbelief. He had told her once that he never expected to find happiness, that he had resigned himself to a life of solitude and quiet desperation. But here he was, standing in a church, waiting to marry the woman he loved. It was, he said later, the greatest miracle of his life. After the wedding, they returned to the farm. Spring had transformed the valley just as Silas had promised, and wildflowers bloomed everywhere Clara looked. Lupines and columbines and Indian paintbrush, more colors than she could count, more beauty than she had ever imagined. Clara took the teaching position in Silver Creek, riding the 40 kilometers each day on a gentle mare that Silas had bought for her. The children adored her, and she adored them in return, finding joy in their curiosity and their laughter and their endless questions about the world. It was the life she had dreamed of, the fresh start she had been seeking, but so much better than she had ever imagined because she had someone to share it with. The years that followed were not always easy. There were hard winters and failed harvests, sick animals and broken fences, all the struggles that came with carving a life out of the wilderness. But there were also moments of profound beauty and joy. The birth of their first child, a boy they named Thomas, after Silas's fallen friend. The sight of wildflowers blooming in the valley each spring. The quiet evenings spent together by the fire, reading and talking and simply being. Clara never forgot the accident, the terror of lying broken on that mountain road, the despair of believing she would never walk again. But she no longer thought of it as the worst day of her life. Instead, she thought of it as the day everything changed. The day she was given a second chance, an opportunity to rebuild herself from the ground up, to discover who she really was and what she was truly capable of. And she thought of Silas, the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and carried her 30 kilometers through the wilderness, the man who had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. The man who had shown her that broken things could be mended, that survival was its own kind of victory, and that love could bloom in the most unlikely places. One evening, many years later, Clara sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink and purple. Silas sat beside her, his hair now streaked with grey, his face weathered by time and sun and wind. Their children and grandchildren were gathered in the yard, laughing and playing and filling the valley with the sounds of life. "Do you ever think about that day?" Clara asked. "The day you found me?" Silas took her hand in his grip still strong despite the years. "Every day," he said, "it was the day my life began." Clara leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. She thought about all the paths her life could have taken, all the ways things could have gone wrong, if the stagecoach hadn't crashed, if Silas hadn't come along, if she had given up, given in to despair, let the darkness swallow her whole. But she hadn't. She had survived. She had healed. She had found love in the most unlikely place, with the most unlikely person, and she had built a life that exceeded her wildest dreams. "Thank you," she said softly. Silas looked at her, his brown eyes still holding that same gentleness she had seen on the first night they met. "For what?" "For carrying me," Clara said. "Not just that first night. Every day since. For never letting me fall." Silas smiled and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I would carry you to the ends of the earth, Clara Hartley. I would carry you through fire and flood and the darkest night. You are the love of my life, the best thing that ever happened to me. And I will keep carrying you until my last breath." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy, of gratitude, of a love so deep and true that it defied description. She had come west seeking a fresh start, a chance to outrun her past and build a new future. What she had found was so much more. She had found a home, a family, a purpose. She had found the man she was meant to spend her life with, the partner she had always dreamed of but never believed she would find. And it had all begun with an accident, a broken body, and a stranger who had appeared out of nowhere to carry her through the wilderness. Some might call it fate. Some might call it luck. But Clara preferred to call it what it truly was: a miracle. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and indigo, and Clara Hartley sat on her porch with her husband's hand in hers, surrounded by the family they had built together, feeling more blessed than she had ever imagined possible. The road that had brought her here had been long and painful, full of obstacles and setbacks and moments of despair. But she wouldn't change a single step of it, because every step had led her exactly where she was meant to be: home. In the years that followed, Clara often told the story of how she and Silas had met, how a stagecoach accident had left her broken on a mountain road, how a stranger had appeared and carried her 30 kilometers through the wilderness, how that act of kindness had blossomed into love, into marriage, into a lifetime of happiness. The story became something of a legend in Silver Creek. People would point to Clara and Silas when they came into town, would whisper about the farmer who had walked 30 kilometers with a woman in his arms, who had nursed her back to health and then married her. It was the kind of story that made people believe in miracles, in the power of love to overcome any obstacle, in the idea that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can turn out to be the best. Clara never tired of telling it. Even when she was old and grey, when her children were grown and her grandchildren had children of their own, she would gather them around her and tell them about the day she had been given a second chance at life, about the man who had seen something worth saving in a broken woman lying in the dirt, about the love that had grown between them, slowly and steadily, until it had become the foundation of everything she held dear. "Never give up," she would tell them. "No matter how dark things seem, no matter how impossible the situation feels, never give up, because you never know when a miracle is just around the corner, waiting to change your life forever." And she meant every word. Silas Hartley died in his sleep one autumn night, 60 years after he had carried Clara through the wilderness. She found him in the morning, his face peaceful, his hand still reaching for the pillow where she usually lay. The doctor said it was his heart, that it had simply stopped beating in the night, that he hadn't suffered. Clara grieved, of course. She grieved the loss of the man who had been her partner for 6 decades, the father of her children, the love of her life. But she did not despair. She had learned long ago that grief was a natural part of life, that it was the price we pay for loving deeply, and that it could be carried without being crushed by it. She lived for another 5 years after Silas's death, surrounded by the family they had built together, in the cabin they had shared for more than half a century. And when her time finally came, she went peacefully, with a smile on her face, and her husband's name on her lips. They buried her beside Silas in the cemetery at the edge of the valley where the wildflowers bloomed every spring. Their headstone bore a simple inscription, chosen by their eldest son. 2 broken souls who found healing in each other, together forever. And every spring, when the lupines and columbines and Indian paintbrush covered the valley in a riot of color, their descendants would gather at the grave and remember. They would tell the story of the stagecoach accident, of the farmer who had walked 30 kilometers with a woman in his arms, of the love that had grown from that single act of kindness and lasted a lifetime. It was, everyone agreed, the most beautiful love story they had ever heard, and somewhere beyond the veil of death, Clara and Silas were together again. Walking hand in hand through fields of wildflowers, their bodies young and whole, their hearts full of the love that had sustained them through every challenge and every triumph. Some stories end with happily ever after, but Clara and Silas's story didn't end at all. It simply continued on and on through generations and centuries, a testament to the power of love and the resilience of the human spirit. Because true love never dies. It just changes form, passing from one generation to the next, a gift that keeps on giving, a miracle that never ends. And that perhaps is the most beautiful ending of all. In the town of Silver Creek, there is a museum now. It's a small building, nothing fancy, but it contains artifacts from the town's early days. Old photographs and newspaper clippings, farming equipment and household goods, the debris of lives long since ended. In one corner, behind a glass case, there is a pair of worn leather boots. They belonged to Silas Hartley, the card explains, and they are the same boots he wore the night he carried Clara Whitmore 30 kilometers through the wilderness. They are cracked and faded, the leather worn thin in places, but they are treasured nonetheless. Beside the boots is a faded photograph of Clara and Silas on their wedding day. She is beautiful in a simple white dress, her hair piled atop her head, her eyes shining with joy. He stands beside her, tall and strong, looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Visitors to the museum often pause before this display. They read the story printed on the card about the stagecoach accident and the farmer who walked 30 kilometers with a woman in his arms. They look at the boots and the photograph and they shake their heads in wonder. Can you imagine, they say to each other, walking 30 kilometers through the wilderness, carrying someone the whole way? It's incredible. And it is incredible. But what's even more incredible is what came after, the love that grew between two broken people, the family they built together, the life they shared, full of joy and sorrow and everything in between. That more than the walk itself is what makes the story truly remarkable. Not the physical feat, but the emotional journey, the transformation of two lonely souls into one complete whole. The miracle of finding love in the most unlikely place, at the most unlikely time, with the most unlikely person. It's a story that has been told and retold countless times over the years. In books and newspapers, in family gatherings and community events, in whispered conversations between lovers who look at each other and wonder if their love could ever be so strong, so enduring, so true. And every time it's told, it reminds people of something important, something that's easy to forget in the chaos and struggle of daily life, that love is real, that miracles happen, that no matter how broken you might be, there is always hope for healing, for redemption, for a second chance at happiness. Clara Hartley knew this better than anyone. She had lived it, breathed it, built her entire life around it. And though she is gone now, her story lives on, a beacon of hope for all who hear it, a reminder that the darkest night is always followed by dawn. So if you ever find yourself lying broken on a mountain road, staring up at an impossibly blue sky and wondering if anyone will come to save you, remember Clara's story. Remember that help can come from the most unexpected places. Remember that broken things can be mended. Remember that love has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. And never, ever give up hope. Because you never know when a miracle is just around the corner, waiting to change your life forever. The end.